Good afternoon and welcome to the Sharp 2 Naturalistic Driving Study and Roadway Information Database Research and Opportunities Training Session. This is the fourth in a series of 4 webinars related to FHWA's Safety Training and Analysis Center, which is located at the Turner Fairbanks Highway Research Center. I'm just moving this poll out of the way. Today's session will cover an overview of the Sharp 2 NDS and RID datasets. We'll hear information related to the NDS Pooled Fund Study number 1427, and we'll hear from some state DOTs and their research related to Sharp 2. And finally, Omar Smati from Iowa State's C-Tree will lead a general discussion related to the NDS, RID, and Pooled Fund Study. If you have any questions during the session, please feel free to enter them into the chat box as we go, and we'll answer those along with others raised during the Q&A session at the end. Now I'd like to turn it over to Charles Fay with the Federal Highway Administration. Charles is FHWA's Sharp 2 Research Program Manager for the Safety Training and Analysis Center and will be providing more information on the STAC and the Pooled Fund Study. Charles?
Okay, thanks, Brett. Okay, for those of you who've attended previous STAC webinars, this is a familiar slide to you. The STAC is part of FHWA's implementation efforts related to the Sharp 2 safety data, also referred to as the Sharp 2 Naturalistic Driving Study and Roadway Information Database data. And part of that effort, the STAC established these 4 goals. Those are the ones underlined, and the various activities to support those goals are the ones in bullet points. So for the first goal, to expand understanding, that's where the training comes into play, and this webinar series falls under that goal. We also have recently received approval to be the first secure remote enclave to access the Sharp 2 data, including the personal identifiable information, the face video, raw GPS, and crash location. And this is also a potential benefit of participating in the pooled fund because we'd have access to that enclave. To expand usability, various tools are in development, either through Federal Highway's Exploratory Advanced Research Program, the video analytic tools, but the STAC is also developing a set of reduced data sets that will be made available to the research public. And then the focus of today of research opportunities. So before I go into and start talking about the pooled fund, wanted to highlight that the STAC is here to support DOTs with their own projects, so we can help you scope out your own RFP in terms of using the Sharp 2 NDS and RID. And let's see. Okay. So since we might have some new folks on here, I'm going to begin with some material that I presented in a previous webinar, actually from a different webinar series. So on April 5th of last year, we provided a bunch of information primarily related to the pooled fund, and that webinar is recorded and on the STAC website, and a link to the STAC website is at the end of my slide deck. So if you want more information, I suggest you review that webinar. But to set the stage as to why an NDS. So to date, DOT decision makers, and for that matter, researchers and predictive modelers, have relied on information derived from sources such as crash histories for safety, traffic and travel time data for operations, and household surveys for the planning field. Now, none of these data provide insight into driver behavior, and 2 of them, the crash reports and the surveys, are self-reporting. So if we were just to use crash reports as an example, and let's say that I'm the driver, I get into the crash. Neuroscience has recently shown that your memory changes every time you remember the event. So even before the police officer shows up to record what happened, all that stuff's going on in my mind. So I'm potentially getting further and further away from what actually happened and potentially rationalizing what happened. Well, then the police officer shows up, and we know that there are a variety of recording mechanisms. No one's doing this consistently. And then the officer is now also interpreting what I'm telling him. So I'm getting further and further away from the truth. That gets put down into a file, into the crash report. Decisions are made on that information, and millions, if not billions of dollars get spent. And so just to pause for a second as to what is a naturalistic driving study. So anytime you end up seeing NDS in my slides, that refers to naturalistic driving study. The whole idea here is you want the participants to forget they're in a study. And so the participants came in with their own vehicles, and each of their vehicles was instrumented with a variety of equipment, sensors, video, and other sensors. And then the participants went about their normal driving. And we have a tremendous amount of data that have been recorded. And so what the NDS does is it ultimately gets us closer to what actually happened. So let's take a crash, for example. We actually could have a crash report, but now we actually have recorded the fraction of a second video and other sensor data that recorded that all the factors leading up to that crash. Now, the NDS data were originally collected for highway safety, since driver behavior is a contributing factor in over 90% of the crashes, but it's also the thing we know the least about. The NDS data also offers previous unavailable information on driver behavior to highway operations and planning and how the roads are actually being used. So just a general question to the highway safety practitioners out there, have you ever wanted more information on why crashes occur or how crashes were avoided? What about the impacts of speeding, tailgating, cell phone use, for example? For the highway planners, what could you do with information from 5.4 million trips continuously recorded to have a better understanding of route and destination choice? Weekend and week-out travel patterns, seasonality of travel patterns, trip chaining, and even air quality and emissions evaluations. And then for the highway operation practitioners, do you have any interest in better understanding driver behavior under a variety of conditions, such as traffic, weather, work zones? And what about the causes of non-recurring congestion? So these are just some things to consider as we go through today's webinar. Okay, so this slide is slightly misformatted, but this is the data set in a nutshell. We have a one-of-a-kind data set, mentioned already before, collected for safety. Now we have information on how crashes occur, how crashes were avoided, and equally important, how people are actually normally driving when no events are occurring, exposure data. The left-hand part of the slide represents what we refer to as the NDS data. That's the driver data, the driving data, the trip data, and the vehicle data. And then the right-hand part of the slide represents the Roadway Information Database. That provides information on the roadway as well as other information on weather, traffic, crash histories. So together, SHARP2 has captured the system of driver, vehicle, and roadway environment. So we not only have the trip data, but we actually have the context for those trips. Okay, so the SHARP2 NDS database, this is not a crash database. Rather, it's a database of approximately 3,500 participants collected over 2 years that have captured 5.4 million trips, continuously recorded ignition on to ignition off, from which we're able to infer driver behavior. 30 million miles were traveled. Our focus was on passenger cars. It just so happens this database also happens to have 1,600 crashes. Approximately 200 to 250 of those fall into the category of police reportable, so the types of crashes you're familiar with. But now, as we mentioned before, we have actually observational data of what really happened from the videos and sensor data in addition to the crash report. In addition to those that fall under police reportable, now we also have information on crashes we've never had any information on before, as well as near crashes. So we have approximately 3,000 near crashes in the database. And as I mentioned, a vast amount of exposure everyday driving as to how the folks are using the roads. This is kind of a nutshell as to what's in the NDS. So when the participants came in to get their cars instrumented with the sensors, they went through a variety of testing, and that's shown here under the assessments. We have information on the vehicle. What's shown here is continuous data. That's the time series data. That's the data that's collected ignition on to ignition off. On the Insight website, which has brought you insight to the data, there's 5.4 million trip summaries, and that kind of gives you an indication of a small amount of the information that's on there. The website also has information on events. So the events here would either be crashes, near crashes. Also around 20,000, 30,000 baselines have also been coded as well. A small subsample of the participants gave permission to get access to their cell phone records, so we have that information. Now, all this information is linkable to that Roadway Information Database. And the next two slides I'm going to go through very quickly, but it'll just give you a general idea of the type of data in the RID. And for the most part, this should be review for folks on the phone. But I just wanted to present some of these slides in case we had any new members. So to think about the RID basically has two types of data. New data that SHARP2 went out and collected consistently in 6 states. In quality assured, there were data specifications for each of these data types. So we have information on lane, shoulder, intersection control type. We have over 500,000 MUTCD signs coded, horizontal curvature, grade and cross slope information, medians, barriers, and presence of rumble strips, as well as lighting. In addition to the new data that SHARP2 went out to collect themselves, SHARP2 also acquired existing data. So we have the HPMS files as well as the state DOT roadway inventory files. We have a variety of weather data sources, traffic data, 7 years of crash histories for the sites, safety laws that were existed in the area, 511 information where we're able to derive work zones as well as railroad crossings. Okay, I'm not going to go into much information on data access. That was actually the subject matter for the first webinar we held in this particular webinar series, and that was held on November 30th. That was recorded, and that recording will be made available shortly on the STAC website. If you would like access to that before we post it, just send me an email. I'll be happy to send you a link to the recording. But what I'm doing here is I more wanted to highlight any of the issues in terms of getting access to the time series data, which requires, it's referred to as in-depth data, which requires a data use license, IRB approval or exemption. There are data costs, and as we said before, PII, or personal identifiable information, has to be accessed in a secure data enclave. All this stuff would be managed by the pooled fund and the STAC, and you wouldn't have to worry about it. Okay. So now I'm going to talk to you about the pooled fund. As Brett said, it is number 1427, and it's posted now on the pooledfund.org website. So, you know, as I said before, the STAC is FHWA's primary implementation effort related to the SHARP2 Naturalistic Driving Study and Roadway Information Database. Since the data are not only new to DOTs but researchers as well, we thought a pooled fund would be the most efficacious way to provide value back to the states and provide support, as well as giving you individual support, as I mentioned before, on your own RFPs. I've mentioned that this is not a crash history database, not household surveys, and this is not meant to replace those previous methods, rather to enhance that with a missing component by being able to bring in driver behavior. So we hope that this pooled fund would allow a strategic coordinated approach, and it's actually a great way to minimize your risk, get involved in utilizing this resource to address issues not only in safety but in operations and planning. Our essential goal here is to extract as much value from this data as possible. We want to address high priority issues to local and state DOTs. We want to leverage our resources, and we actually want some sound, actionable results. So that could result in the development or improvement of predictive models and design guides, the development and improvement of countermeasures, policy recommendations, etc. So while this will be an FHWA-led pooled fund, this is for the state and local DOTs. So we hope that we have very active participation from local and state agencies. A technical advisory committee, a TAC, will be appointed, and that will be comprised of participating members. So by joining, you will have a voice. The TAC will define the research needs. You'll determine the yearly funding allocation for research, select the projects, approve the research teams, and ultimately oversee the work to ensure the objectives are met. Now, the STAC would not only manage the pooled fund and handle the finances, but with oversight and approval of the TAC, will provide added value by developing work plans to meet the TAC's research needs. We can participate in some of the research. We'll handle the contracting in terms of contracting with a great pool of research contractors that we have available through the various IDIQs, the indefinite deliverable, indefinite quantity that we have set up through the Offices of Safety, R&D, Office of Operations, and Office of Planning. We also have access to existing data sets that were developed. So these are existing reduced data sets from the 2 petabytes of NDS data that were developed with public funds. And as I mentioned before, all the issues or hassles in terms of getting data access, in terms of the IRB, getting access to PII data, this would all be managed and handled by the STAC and the pooled fund. I mentioned that we have access to researchers from the variety of FHWA's IDIQs, but we have also other mechanisms, and we could go out for an RFP. This would all be up to the TAC and what they prefer. So by participating in this pooled fund, you'll minimize your risk. We can leverage resources. I highlighted this data is new to the community. We have access to a very talented researcher pool. There's a lot of knowledge that we've learned over the last 2 years and a lot of lessons learned, and we can actually provide a coordinated effort here. The data actually has a cost to it. So actually the data processing costs that we're seeing on some of our phase 2 projects, the cost of that to process that data actually is more than the minimum suggested amount that we're actually recommending, which I'll show you on the next slide. And then we can leverage costs as well as maximize use of the publicly funded data sets, as I mentioned before. And then in terms of data privacy and data access, we've discussed this a couple times in terms of the STAC Secure Data Enclave. This would facilitate access to face video, origin and destination information, and crash locations. And then we can handle all your data access issues. So this is the slide that I hear people usually grunt, but I want you to, if the minimum contribution of $50K a year is too much, just look at what I have highlighted in red. But before we get there, we have a minimum suggested contribution of $50,000 per year per state for a 5-year period. If you can't commit for 5 years and you only can commit on a yearly basis, that's fine. A waiver has been approved to use 100% SBNR funds without a non-federal match. And while we encourage the suggested minimum based on the cross-cutting scope of safety operations and planning, we do understand this is an issue for some. So the resolution here is simply reach out to me. My email is at the end of this slide deck. We really want to encourage as much participation as possible. Now, in addition to the waiver, Federal Highway feels so strongly about this that Federal Highway is going to contribute $1 million over the 5 years of the project. Okay, and this is our contact information. Here's my colleague Yusuf Mohammed Shah and myself. If you have any questions about the NDS data, the STAC, or the pooled fund, please reach out to us. And with that, Brett, I will turn it back to you.
All right, thank you, Charles. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Omar Smati. Omar Smati is a professor of civil engineering at Iowa State University and C-Tree director at Intrans. Omar was the principal investigator on the original project to develop the Roadway Information Database.
Thank you, Brett, and good afternoon and good morning to you out there. So our next piece is going to be a presentation and also a discussion from state DOTs, and I'm going to introduce the 3 speakers, and then we'll go with the presentation and the discussion. So our three speakers are first from AASHTO, Pam Hutton. Pam is the SHARP 2 implementation manager. She's been with AASHTO since 2012. Before joining AASHTO, she was with the Colorado DOT. She was actually the chief engineer at the Colorado DOT from 2006 to 2011. Our next speaker is going to be Tim McDowell. He is with the Wyoming DOT. He's been there since 1981. He administers the DOT's research program, and he's the RAC, SCORE, and the TRB representative for the Wyoming DOT. He's going to also be helped this afternoon by Mohammed Ahmed, who is with the University of Wyoming. Our last DOT speaker is Dean Kanitz. He's with the Michigan DOT. He's the safety data and analysis engineer since 2012, and before that he was the transportation safety engineer with the Michigan DOT. So with that, I'm going to hand it to Pam to give us AASHTO's perspective, and then Tim and Dean will give us their experience using the SHARP 2 and being involved in the Implementation Assistance Program projects. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Omar. This is Pam Hutton, and as Omar said, I am a SHARP 2 implementation manager for the AASHTO organization. And before I worked for AASHTO, I worked for the Colorado Department of Transportation. Just to shout out to those guys, I see they're on the phone, and it's wonderful to have you join us. So shout out to Colorado. Anyway, let me get started here. I wasn't sure how much you might know about the SHARP 2 implementation in general, so I'm going to quickly go through a couple of high-level SHARP 2 implementation slides, and then I'll bring it down specifically to safety. So just at a glance here, SHARP 2, let's go back. SHARP 2 really has 63 products that we're implementing across the program in 4 focus areas, safety being one. The solutions, we call them SHARP 2 solutions because they address some key challenges that the Departments of Transportation were facing at the time the research began. And they include processes and software, testing procedures, and other specifications. We refined those products in field testing during research and continue to do some of that in the actual implementation phase. We have 430 or more than transportation projects across the country using SHARP 2 products, and we're really excited about that. Our goal is that transportation agencies across the country will adopt these practices as their standard practice or specification in the future. And then we have an aspect to the SHARP 2 implementation program that includes bringing this information into the classroom as part of the university curriculum, and so we call that the education connection. The idea is that we're training up our new professionals that will be graduating soon. SHARP 2 implementation has actually provided $130 million in funding assistance to DOTs, MPO, local agencies, universities, and federal lands, as well as tribes. That's out of the $170 million that we have for implementation. We've been able to provide that funding assistance in terms of real dollars or technical assistance to DOTs and other transportation agencies all across the country, again, implementing 63 different products in 430 projects. We have engaged over 200,000 participants in the program. We've done various outreach activities, almost 9,000 outreach activities that include trainings, workshops, peer exchanges, demonstrations, and showcases. And we've provided nearly 15,000 hours of technical assistance to those transportation agencies that are attempting to adopt these products as standard practice. That sets this program apart from other programs. Typically, we don't have this kind of technical assistance readily available to the states who are trying to adopt new procedures. In terms of the Implementation Assistance Program as it relates to safety, we had, and this would be FHWA and AASHTO, had some main objectives. We wanted to utilize the Implementation Assistance Program to demonstrate the use of the NDS safety data. We wanted to increase the state's understanding of the potential uses for the data and to gain and have them gain some experience using the data without as much risk because we were providing the funding to them to do so. But we didn't just want this to be an exercise in research. What we really wanted this to be was research leading to countermeasure development. Things out in the field that would actually reduce crashes and save lives. And that, I have to say, it was our main focus in conceiving the Implementation Assistance Program as it relates to safety. To help us do that, AASHTO created a safety task force. And so it's a special committee of the AASHTO organization. They are collaborating with FHWA, TRB, and other research teams. They are overseeing the Safety Implementation Assistance Program as a whole for AASHTO. They've reviewed research proposals and research findings. I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a minute. They engage themselves in promoting opportunities for state DOTs to take advantage of this database. They are trying to provide this customer user perspective to TRB's Safety Data Oversight Committee, which is a committee that's charged with trying to provide these databases in a way that makes the most sense for users across the country, as well as trying to determine what a business model might look like so that after SHARP 2 goes away, the databases can continue to be provided, maintained, and updated in perpetuity. And that's a challenge. And so hats off to that committee who is working so diligently to make sure that we continue to have this very rich data source available to us. The Safety Task Force has conference calls once a month. They monitor the progress of the research teams, the IAP selected teams, through a series of interviews, and they also are very engaged in reporting the findings of all of this research, the Implementation Assistance Program with the safety focus, to FHWA and TRB as well. So really, the Safety Task Force is providing that state DOT perspective to the other agencies, what it's like to work with this database and how it can be beneficial to the state DOTs in their efforts to reduce crashes and injuries on the state highway systems. The Implementation Assistance Program, as it was focused on safety, had 3 phases associated with it. Unlike the other parts of the Implementation Assistance Program in SHARP, safety was a little different. It actually had 3 phases of implementation, which included a proof of concept phase, a phase where the safety data research teams were looking at a full set of data for their particular research question, and then a phase that really involved the deployment of countermeasures that were developed as a result of the research that they were doing. Okay, so in phase 1, which is our proof of concept, so in this phase, the research teams submitted proposals. This is what they would like to do. This is what they would hope to accomplish. The Safety Task Force has specific safety topic areas that included pedestrian safety, roadway departures, speeding. They were interested in work zones, horizontal and vertical curves as it might relate to crashes, interchange ramps and the spacing of such, adverse weather conditions or other roadway conditions, and roadway lighting. So they reviewed we had an overwhelming response. We had over 30 states respond that they would be interested in doing a research study. We actually picked 10 states and 11 projects from the 30 applications that we received, and those teams proceeded through phase 1 using a sample, a small data set, to prove that they could actually answer their safety question using this database. At the end of 9 months, the teams came back to the Safety Task Force and talked to the Safety Task Force about what they found in their pilot research. And I will say that all of the teams were really excited with the potential of the research findings using that database. They didn't find any fatal flaws in their research or ability to use the database to answer their safety questions. They even went so far as to give us a sample of potential, and I want to, put that in quotes, potential outcomes, which might include in the future new data processing tools, new highway lighting standards, new crash modification factors, new methods for establishing speed limits and advisory speeds. That would be groundbreaking. And new understanding about the effectiveness of work zone devices, messaging, and campaigns. And again, this is all, we always had some ideas about that as it related to crash history, but this was about how drivers behave in the real world with all of their experiences, interacting with their vehicle, interacting with the roadway, interacting with the devices that they see on the road. At the end of phase 1, then they proposed, most of them proposed a 2-year in-depth research study, and then we moved in, and we were surprised that their phase 2 costs were lower than we had actually anticipated they would be. So in phase 2, of the 10 states, 11 research projects, we picked 9 teams to conduct studies all across the country in those same areas of interest to the Safety Task Force. So we didn't eliminate any of those areas of interest, but did eliminate a couple of teams. Their research reports are now due at the middle of April, and we'll be listening to their phase 2 presentations and making phase 3 selections on May 1st and 2nd. So again, phase 2 was doing in-depth research, trying to get answers to their safety questions, having them present that to us, and then for the Safety Task Force to make some selections about which of those research projects would go into full countermeasure development and deployment. This is just a little bit of a timeline. Phase 2 teams were given notice in January of 2016. Today, it's February of 2017. They've known that they were selected for approximately a year. They are not going to have their full 2 years of research, so we're asking them to provide early research findings at the middle of April and to present at the beginning of May. So they won't have their finalized research done, but they'll have enough done. We anticipate that we'll be able to make those selections for phase 3, which is the deployment phase. Again, this is the most important phase in terms of AASHTO and the state DOT's interest in the database. Research is great. We love research. We like doing research, but the most important piece for us is really how do we deploy the knowledge that we've learned through the research to reduce crashes on the highway. We expect that the phase 3 selections will adopt, champion, and implement those countermeasures. We hope nationally. We hope that they'll integrate their findings into manuals, guidelines, policies, conduct pilot testing, and we hope that all of that will begin in September of 2017. The money for SHARP 2 has to all be obligated by September 30th, which is the reason we had to speed up the conclusion of phase 2. The Safety Task Force does many different things. Part of what they have been doing is monitoring the progress. So this is a new kind of research. This is new data. We weren't sure how easily it would be to use the data. We weren't sure if the teams would be able to receive and query the data the way that they had hoped to. And so we've been doing a series of interviews with them and reporting back to TRB and FHWA to make the user experience better in the future. And that's what this slide really was all about. In those survey questions, we've covered what it was like to get a data use license, what it was it like to contract with VTTI to get the NDS data, what was it like to access the data, what technical assistance was provided by VTTI and ISU to help them in their tasks, what programmatic process improvements might help future users, and also what specific, so this data set really had never been used in a widespread manner before our implementation assistance program studies launched, and what was it like to use that data, and what specific issues did they have? Were there bugs in the program? Were there issues that needed to be resolved so that future users could use it better? And our teams have been great at providing that additional data to us just so that we can make that user experience better in the future. Our next steps is that we will continue to monitor the progress of Phase 2 to its conclusion. We'll conduct an additional set of interviews. In fact, we're starting those right now here in February. We are also working closely with FHWA as they embark on their state-based NDS projects to see if some of the things that we've identified as challenges are improved. We're looking forward to finding and listening to the findings of Phase 2 and making selections for Phase 3. Again, we're really excited about Phase 3 because that's the deployment phase. And then I guess this is just a plug for encouraging additional state DOT engagement. We have really worked closely with FHWA on the pooled fund studies, and Charles already mentioned this, but I'll just say from a DOT perspective, I really think this is a great way for states to get involved. If you haven't already gotten involved, it really minimizes your risks and leverages a large amount of funding for you specifically to achieve some of your safety goals. He mentioned it, but we found out through our implementation assistance program experience that the contribution that Charles is asking for or requesting in the pooled fund study would just barely cover what it would cost you to actually receive a data set from VTTI to do your own research. So this is a great way to get involved with a much smaller investment. He said, and I know it's true, that you can negotiate your level of commitment with Charles. You don't really have to pay that whole $50,000 per year if you just can't afford it, but you want to get involved. If you're a state, and I think CDOT, Colorado Department of Transportation, was a state like this, our safety office really hadn't been involved in pool fund studies. We've done some in maintenance. We've certainly done some in pavement, but we hadn't really done that in safety before. So it's kind of a new way of getting involved at a national level, and I would encourage you to investigate that. And also, I believe Colorado was a state that couldn't commit themselves for more than 1 year at a time. We could make some verbal commitments. It's our intent to contribute for the next 5 years, but we could only contract for 1 year at a time as our budgets were approved by the governor. And so I know Charles is willing to negotiate that with you as well. So bottom line here is I would love to see more state DOT engagement using these databases to improve their safety across the roadways within their states. So I think that wraps up my presentation, and I'm going to turn it back to Omar to introduce our next speakers.
Thank you, Pam. And this is a fantastic segue to our two next speakers, Wyoming and Michigan, talking about, even though they're two states, we're not part of the six sites in terms of the NDS study. They still got involved with SHARP 2, and I'm going to turn it back to Tim and Mohammed, Wyoming experience.
Thank you, Omar. This is Tim McDowell, Wyoming DOT, and just to give you a quick experience, we reluctantly were brought into this, and thanks to Pam pushing us, we decided to go ahead and put in for a phase 1 study. Wyoming gets a lot of adverse weather, heavy high winds, blowing snow. We have Interstate 80, which is a major freight corridor, west coast to east coast, and it's highly impacted by adverse weather. We have implemented variable speed limits across Interstate 80, and it's dependent a lot on weather. And so the algorithms, we were looking at how does drivers actually behave when faced with adverse weather. So phase 1 was just real proof of concept. Do drivers actually change their driver behaviors? If so, can we capture that? And then can it change our algorithms? We were told you're never going to do it. Well, we proved we could. We got very excited by the results, and as we were looking at the results, we always looked at it towards actually implementing. If we can actually see what drivers do, we can actually tweak our algorithms and keep people safer on the roadways. We were so excited that we pushed for a phase 2. We pitched for that. We were one of the successful candidates. We wanted to go beyond just a real small data set and move from what we looked at in phase 1 was just rain to all kinds of weather, fog, snow, and blowing snow, things of that nature. Our research is showing, and I'm going to turn this over to Mohammed here real quick, yes, we are able to find driver behaviors and their reactions, and we should be able to change our algorithms, tweak them in order to make the road safer. We recently pitched this idea to the main person involved in our traffic management center and our ITS, who is very involved with the freight corridor and also happens to be on the connected automated vehicle freight study in Wyoming that has to do with freight. And he got so excited, he's wanting to take over and pitch for a phase 3 so that we can actually deploy the results and follow through with actual showing how this is actually working. With that, from a state perspective, it was a little bit of hard work. We were pulled reluctantly into it, but we got very excited and we're really pushing forward. But it's actually the work of our researcher and their people that has really pushed us forward. So I'm going to turn it over to Mohammed from the University of Wyoming. Mohammed?
Thanks, Tim. This is Mohammed Ahmed from University of Wyoming. I don't have a formal presentation on me, but I'm going to talk about the objectives of this study and research questions and answers we developed in phase 1, what we are currently working on in phase 2, and what we hope to deploy in phase 3. As Tim mentioned, the impact of the adverse weather condition on safety, we all know that NHTSA estimated about that more than 24% of all crashes are weather-related. So what we're researching here is how drivers respond to adverse weather and road conditions on freeways specifically. In particular, our study is trying to gain insights into what drivers are actually doing during adverse weather and road conditions, understand driver dynamics with regard to speed selection, spacing, and headways, car following model in adverse weather conditions, how drivers adjust their behaviors to compensate for increased risks due to reductions in visibility, and how these behaviors may affect the effectiveness of safety countermeasures. Specifically, we're talking here about the variable speed limit or the weather-based variable speed limit system we have on I-80 in Wyoming. What we hope in phase 3 to do is to deploy and implement some human factors into the variable speed limit algorithm. So instead of just a weather-based VSL algorithm, it will have some human factors and driver behavior inputs in it. So we came up with 4 research questions in phase 1. The first main research question was to check if we can really identify threats in inclement weather conditions from the NDS data. So how can we do extraction of adverse weather conditions? This is really unique because All other projects are starting from the RID data somehow, identifying specific types of intersections, and then they go and query data from the NDS. Here the story is a little bit different. We need actually to identify trips in adverse weather conditions. So we needed to come up with a methodology to extract data and extract trips in the NDS dataset. We were successful in phase 1. We did that, and we developed a methodology to extract heavy rain trips. We had like 50 trips from Washington and Florida states. In phase 2, we're actually extending this into the 6 states, and we're looking into all adverse weather conditions, including fog, snow, slush, blowing wind. Right now, we have more than 2,500 trips identified in adverse weather conditions from the 6 states. And second research questions we're working on is if we can characterize driver behavior and performance from the NDS data. We did that on heavy rain in phase 1. We're doing this now on other weather conditions in phase 3. We're also looking into another research question to identify safety surrogate measures for weather-related crashes. In phase 1, we had only 3 near crashes that we looked into some safety surrogate measures. In phase 2, we got about 200 near crashes in adverse weather conditions that we're currently looking at. The fourth research question was in phase 1 to examine suitable methodology to analyze the NDS data. We came up with different statistical techniques we used in phase 1. We're using more statistical techniques in second phase. We also, in phase 2, we extended or added additional research question if we can use the NDS data to see, like, if we have some connected vehicle, and I-80, I'm sure that most of you knows that I-80 will have the connected vehicle pilots on it very soon, in a year and a half, mostly. We also needed to know if we can integrate some of the understanding of driver behavior and adverse weather condition within the connected vehicle algorithm, the messages that we're going to disseminate and share with driver on I-80 specifically. With this, I'll be happy to take any questions.
To ask a question on the phone lines, please press *1 on your telephone keypad. A voice prompt on your line will indicate when your line is open.
Yeah, sorry, we're going to continue with the presentation from Michigan with Dean, and then we're going to open the floor for discussion from whether questions or discussion from everybody else on the webinar. So thank you, Tim, and thank you, Mohammed. Dean, you want to give us your perspective from Michigan?
Sure. Just as everyone is calling in today, I think we're all looking for a sense of opportunity to make a difference, and that's really where we started in Michigan. When the opportunity came about, we solicited out to all of our universities, and we had a few responses from a couple of researchers at a time. At the time, they were with Wayne State University, and since they're at Michigan State University and Iowa State University, so it's a fun coordination effort, respectively. But we started to ask ourselves, really, what are some of the core things that we really need to look at? And we have always wondered, well, why do people select the speeds they travel? So we started looking at the interrelationships of driver behavior, speed limits, and geometry. And the proof of concept, we only wanted to focus on one thing, because with the NDS and the RID, you have to start small and then grow your work, because if you start out too big, you will drown in the data. So we had to remain cognizant of the size of the data. So we focused on freeways primarily in the proof of concept, and it came out very positive. And a piece that came out of that shouldn't be as a big surprise to everyone on the phone and the profession. Drivers that have a wider range of speeds on a facility are more prone to crashes and or near crashes. But that was just a small piece of it. This phase, we are trying to also focus on 2-lane highways, speed limit transition areas, and horizontal curves with speed advisory. We're really trying to examine how the drivers change their speed selection for each of these road types, and then see how the speed limits and other factors affect their mean speed, standard deviation in their speeds, and their crash and near crash risks. And so, I mean, hopefully, not only we're looking at this from a Michigan perspective, but maybe to help out also on the national level, just as a lot of states recently have gone through some speed changes, maybe the tools that are going to come out of this can be used by not only us, but other agencies as well. And it's such an exciting opportunity to just be part of it, because it's not every day we're able to take a full look at the driver behavior at the same point in time that's happening. Driver behavior is one of the reasons why I got into the field, because I always found it interesting how drivers would react if you were to change a sign or change a pavement marking, and you could see their eyes looking as you're standing there at the intersection waiting across what they're really looking at. And so now we actually are able to pinpoint this information and really make a difference in trying to drive toward zero deaths as we proceed. One thing I feel that's relatively unique to Michigan is we have an advisory panel that we utilize at the DOT with a broad view of perspectives from across our department, and we've also brought in some of our state police officers to provide their perspective on how they may even potentially use the outputs of this and to help guide this research forward. It's been a very interesting process, and working with my researchers and conversing with them on a regular basis as to the direction, and I feel like we have a very good grasp on this going forward. So other than that, I'm open for questions if anyone has anything.
Thank you, Dean. So for everybody now, our speakers and also our participants, you can see on the screen kind of general discussion questions in terms of what are our research priorities, whether they're the states or federal highway. We also will talk about some available data sets that we're producing, and when I say we, I'm talking about C3 and VTTI that we're producing for the STAC to make some data available to researchers. Also, we heard Charles and also the folks from Wyoming talking about other applications. How do we get others on board, whether it's the operations folks, planning and asset management, and how do we take this to the implementation stage? Pam talked about the implementation assistance program. We're getting close to phase 3, but that's just one aspect of it. There would be other research, other results. How do we develop this plan to start implementing the products from the SHARP 2 safety program? I know other parts of SHARP 2 research in terms of reliability, and I forgot now the 3 other parts had their own implementation program, and they're more advanced because that work ended up a while back and they're in full implementation. So how do we go about doing that? I would like to maybe hear from Federal Highway a little bit in terms of how do we go about identifying research priorities. I would like the operator to open the phones now so folks who have questions or have comments or participate in the discussion. So maybe we'll just hold off a second and you can give them instructions in terms of how to participate.
And again, that is *1 to ask a question on the phone lines.
And also you can type in your questions in the chat pod. So Charles, I'm going to pick on you and Federal Highway in terms of where do you see some of the research priorities, and how are we working with agencies to develop some of these research priorities that the SHARP 2 safety data can address? And maybe we start there and maybe have the other state DOT folks chime in, Tim and Dean too.
Sure. Thanks, Omar. I'll start, but I'll also reach out to those folks from Federal Highway who are on the webinar to, either call in on your phone line or type in the chat pod. As Pam had mentioned, we are working closely with AASHTO through the Implementation Assistance Program projects. I think between those projects and Federal Highway, in addition to the Pooled Funds Study, has another set of projects that's following a very similar model that Pam outlined in the terms of that three-phase approach, and those fall under our broad agency announcement. Speed management is a key, I think, and we have a number of projects going forward between the IAPs and the BAAs, but also NHTSA has some work that are showing some really actually promising results for the first time. I think also, and then in general, related to anything in terms of safety countermeasures or improvements. So, and I think modeling would fall into that. So using the Highway Safety Manual as an example, my understanding is the majority of the modeling is based on data, crash history data from 2 states. Well, we now have data from 6 states. It's not crash history data, it's SHARP2 NDS data, but they can provide a driver behavior component. Our operations R&D folks have started to see how they can improve their work zone models by incorporating driver behavior as well as weather into that. So, Omar, is that sort of along the line as to where you were trying to get to, or?
Yeah, definitely. And also, like what Wyoming was thinking is they didn't think they could do it, but there is definitely a lot of potential with the SHARP2 data that we got to keep an open mind and kind of think outside the box in terms of how we approach these things. I know Miguel Perez with VTTI is also on the webinar, and I don't know, Miguel, if you can be on the phone. There are other uses also of the SHARP2 data outside the state agencies, and I don't know if Miguel can expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I can't be very specific to protect the people that I get the confidentiality of people that are doing that kind of research. But there are, for example, uses in the automated vehicle arena where people are looking at sort of situations that drivers get in these days, and thereby just kind of considering what implications those might have for automated vehicles. There's applications related to teen drivers, for example. There's some groups looking at that particular population. Older drivers as well. Looking at medical conditions, diabetes, and some of the other diseases that were present within the participant sample, and so generally just different driver characteristics that could influence driver behavior, their propensity for crashes, what kinds of I guess driving cycles these people engage in. So it's not just being involved in a crash or near crash, but also how they drive, when they go out and drive, how far away they go, what kinds of routes they tend to take. So for a teen driver, for example, they might be under restrictions where their mom and dad don't let them go into the interstate, and so how long does it take before that happens, and those kinds of questions. So there's a lot of other types of approaches that may not be, I guess, directly applicable to states, but which may have that the results may have implications for many of the states, for many of the things that states are concerned about.
Thanks, Miguel, and I can kind of follow up on that. We here at Iowa State are trying to do some emission and environmental work in terms of looking at impacts of speed, developing drive cycles, and we had a graduate student who did an internship with the EPA last summer, and we're trying to see how we can utilize the SHARP2 data to do some of that work, because you have the acceleration, deceleration, you have all of that vehicle information, we have the speed limit that comes from the Roadway Information Database, so now we can have a lot more data to be able to develop those drive cycles that are used in emission models. So, you know, a lot of other uses. I want to kind of go back to Tim, and he said, you know, they were reluctantly brought in early on, and now they're excited about the results and the use of the SHARP2 data. Tim, how do we get more DOTs involved in this? I know the pool fund study is a great way to kind of get them started, but from a DOT perspective, setting their research agenda, their priorities in terms of safety, how do we get these DOT folks more aware of the SHARP2, the potential, and how do we get them more involved in the process?
Omar, that's a great question. We were reluctant because we didn't see if we could get any value out of it. But when we had, I guess one of the key things that I look at is looking at your DOT's directive, your vision and mission. And one of our big missions is getting traffic across Interstate 80, primarily freight traffic. 90% of the freight traffic in Wyoming is not destination to Wyoming, it's cross country. And if that freight pipeline breaks down for any reason, it affects the economy of the U.S. One of our big breakdowns is in adverse weather. When I pitched this to the University of Wyoming, they brought up a researcher that was pretty dynamic, thought outside the box, and out of a normal engineering box, you might say. And that was a real important factor in making us successful. It challenged our norms that we had, and it actually caused us to really rethink what we're doing and how we apply our algorithms and other factors that we have. The other part that we looked at after phase one was getting the right influence players involved. For example, we have a connected automated vehicle study across Wyoming with freight. Our director is heavily involved in that. Our traffic management center ITS guy is heavily involved in that. And when we got these results that we were pulling out of the studies, pitched that to them and showed how it would actually help them in their research and then also their daily jobs, that caught their attention. So we're going to be feeding this to our director and to the power players so that they can actually do their jobs better. One of the keys, I'm going to go back to what Dean had mentioned right up when he was sharing. He mentioned he actually wanted to see actual driver behavior, and was that important? And his reaction was, yes, it is important, and they actually got to see it. Well, guess what? We saw the same thing. So I concur with what he's talking about. When you can match actual driver behavior to actual field conditions, whether it's right-hand turns, major urban traffic, or in a major rural setting, and actually see what drivers are doing and then use countermeasures so you can come up with your crash modification factors, etc. That has a powerful message. You know, how far we take it in Wyoming, I don't know, but we're already committed to deploying and actually implementing some of the results that we've already got through phase 2, whether we get phase 3 or not. We are going to implement some of these results, and because it will reduce crashes and increase economic flow. So from a state perspective, jump into it. That's the best thing I can say is if you're going to swim, jump into the water and let's get going, because the NDS has proven out to give results and give you the actual behaviors that you're really looking for. A lot more than what AASHTO or FHWA even thought would be available. And that's what's exciting. When I saw the demonstrations from other states for their research, it really surprised me, and it got me excited about where the future's headed. So that's from my state's perspective. Maybe, Dean, you have a different one.
Well, Tim, I'd like to expand upon what you're talking about in terms of human behavior. One thing that I've noticed in trying to figure out how crashes are occurring within Michigan and otherwise, and that really 2/3 of your crashes are just purely human factor related. And how do you better understand human behavior than to come up with a question and to keep asking yourself questions and how are these behaviors impacting various aspects of your environment. And so we have weather, we have geometry, we even have one that's roadway lighting. Where is that most effective? Pedestrian related, who knows? It's really limited only by your imagination and or ability to process the data and information. And I think that's the key point to really take away is to who can we sit down with within an organization or external to your organization and try and figure out why the crashes are happening relative to human behavior, or just really start that conversation. And then this just kind of helps push it forward to the next level to really reduce the numbers. Because ultimately we need to all get home safe, and our families all need to get home safe, and friends, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Dean. And just a reminder for those who are listening to us who are DOT folks, the majority of the IAP projects were really outside the 6 study sites where the NDS study is. So even though the research is done with the data from those 6 sites, other DOTs can benefit from the results. And you've listened to both Tim and Dean, Michigan and Wyoming, who are, there isn't data, NDS data from Michigan nor Wyoming nor Iowa, where we're doing some work for the Iowa DOT, but the results are valid for other states. And that's really the power of the understanding of how that NDS data can be helpful. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and ask Charles to talk to us a little bit about the available data sets as part of the STAC and what's the plan for that, Charles?
Okay, thanks, Omar. Are you talking about the reduced data sets, the
Yes.
existing? Okay, so we are creating 5 or 4 reduced data sets that have combination of RID data with matching NDS data. Those data sets should be completed by the end of March. There's something called, for those familiar with the Insight website, there's a new data tab on Insight called Dataverse. And so, Miguel, correct me if I'm wrong, but these would be notated on Dataverse and then made available to qualified researchers with a DUL.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. So Omar, maybe I'm going to put you on the spot because I don't have the listing of all of the ones that we're beginning with. So do you remember those of the 5 that you're creating?
Yes, and I actually have both Skylar and Zach here who have been working on creating these reduced data sets. Skylar will give you just a brief summary on the 5 data sets we are producing. I think VTTI is going to develop complementing data sets for 4 of those, and then they're going to create a different one as their 5th data set. So, Skylar?
Yep, so the first data set that we created was a speed limit data set that combined all the speed limits from the mobile, state, and ESRI data that we have to have a speed limit on all roadways throughout all the NDS study sites, or all the study states. Then the next data set is an intersection data set, so it reduces all of the mobile data intersections that we collected and creates a cleaned, a single point per intersection compared to the multiple points used in the original route intersection layer. Then the next layer is a lane database where all of our data that we collected through the mobile data collection was directional. The lane database looks at the entire roadway for both directions of travel. The next one is a curve database, which has all of the curves in a single database and all the attributes that were collected through the curve, so any signs that are present through the curve, whether there's barrier, the lane configuration through the curves, and as well as any other mobile data we collected. Then the final reduced data set is a divided undivided layer. So it creates a layer that defines the roadway as either a divided roadway or an undivided roadway throughout the entire mobile data collection.
And those, became a result of asking some researchers, looking to AASHTO, and also looking to Federal Highway in terms of what the priorities are. And that's how we came up with these 5 reduced data sets. VTTI, as I said, is going to produce a complementary NDS data that goes with 4 of our reduced data sets. I don't think you're producing anything for the lanes, Miguel, if I have that correctly. So Miguel, maybe you can just talk a little bit about your plans in terms of having a subset of the NDS data associated with those.
Yeah, so the idea is to take the data sets that C3 is providing and sort of fill in or summarize some of the human behavior that goes along those features that they're working with. For example, for speed limits, we are producing a data set similar to our map matching table that we've talked about in some of these webinars, where now that we have the speed limit information associated with the links, we can now go in for each of the trips and figure out how fast people were traveling to those links, what was their entry speed, what was their exit speed, average speed, and so on. And a researcher can then come in, look at that information in the context of the speed limit, and start answering a number of research questions relatively easily without really having to invest a whole lot of time or effort or money into generating the underlying data. So that's just one example, and then there'll be similar data sets for some of the other databases or data sets that Omar was talking, or Skylar was talking about. One additional data set coming from the NDS that is not directly related to a data set that Omar is creating, but it is related to the RID, is we're also in the process for Federal Highway of translating the crash locations into sets of roadway features, most of which come from the RID, that would then be available to researchers. There's still some I guess questions about how much that would need to be diluted before the information is not considered potentially identifying. But even if that can't be accomplished, the data set itself would be available within a secure data enclave here at VTTI or within the STAC for researchers to come in, and then at that point, if they're interested in crashes and the roadway characteristics surrounding crashes, they don't really have to go through the process of going to the RID and extracting that information. It's already extracted for them. But again, the goal at some point is to have that be a little more de-identified so it could potentially be shared with the data use license amongst interested researchers.
And this is Charles. I'll just add on that, Omar, and then I guess we can go to questions. And I see that Aladdin has a question. So TRB actually has a contract with Battelle, and Battelle is actually going to kind of kick the tires on the data set that Miguel just talked about, because again, the whole idea here is we were really trying to get that data set outside of an enclave. They'll be reviewing the enclave to determine whether or not you can re-identify participants. I actually have a call with Battelle tomorrow afternoon to begin the discussions on that, but this is all to be determined, and we will keep the community updated once we have an answer.
Yeah, and kind of just to finish this reduced data set discussion, is those would be available to qualified researchers without having to basically pay any of the cost, because those have been funded through Federal Highway. You still have to go through the process in terms of being a qualified researcher, but there is no cost to start working with these data sets. So these could be kind of your entry into working with SHARP2 to develop some comfort level, to develop some expertise, maybe check some proof of concept in terms of research, dealing with these different reduced data sets, and then work with your DOT and agency to, either get them to participate in the pool fund study or fund it through some of their safety research dollars. I was going to pick on Aladdin, but I guess he's not on the phone. So he does have a question for Pam, Dean, and Tim. He's asking if you guys have any suggestions as to how a state DOT employee can make a case to his or her decision makers to present the value of the SHARP 2 pool fund study and ultimately gain the needed support for his or her state to participate. How can we get those decision makers to agree that an investment of $250,000, which is $50 a year for 5 years, is going to pay off at the end of that period? What kind of advice do you have for Aladdin? I'll start with Pam, since you were a decision maker at a DOT as the chief engineer.
Her phone is disconnected. She just put a note in. She's calling back in.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Pam. Maybe, what about Tim or Dean?
This is Tim. I'll take a stab at it. One is, the biggest thing with the pool fund study is the value add. You're going to have to answer that question whatever state you're involved in, especially small states with limited resource. Wyoming is one of them. Our actual research funding is extremely small. Our state budget is taking a massive hit. We have a massive hundreds of millions of dollars shortfall. So you're going to have to actually come into the value add to why you'd be involved in a pool fund study. And one of the keys that I would say there as the state is looking at it is, what questions can you answer with this study or with the database that will impact your performance measures in a way that people go, we need to do that. And one of the key areas there is working with the right, project champions that are going to be influencers that are accepted and respected within the DOT, because they're going to be change agents. And if you don't have them on board, you're dead in the water right off the start. So one of the keys is being able to look at the value add, then work with your research administrator, because that's going to be in competition with the other research that the DOT is looking at. So what's going to make that rise above the rest? If you can answer those questions, then pursue it. If you're not able to answer those questions, it's going to be tough. Another suggestion to add to that would be talk to states who have been working with the SHARP 2 database, the NDS database, get their inputs and see what it's going to take, and then move forward from there if you're going to pursue the pool fund study now or maybe into the future.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. These are really two good suggestions. And that's why if you look at the pool fund, it also talks about more comprehensive. It's not just safety. We're talking about operations planning and asset management. And as Tim discussed, these performance measures, there are safety performance measures, there are operations performance measures, and there are asset management performance measures. So if we can leverage the resources to address multiple questions, I think that would be advantageous and be a good selling point to the decision makers in terms of participating. Dean, do you have something else to add on this topic?
Well, I'd firstly like to say I think Tim did a pretty good job of explaining it. When I start thinking of this, if I was in that position of being an administrator of an organization, how would I, because I don't have time to really go through a big pitch and sale and presentation, I'm going to want to know, well, what are the costs of crashes? And you can get that pretty quick. And you got to really illustrate, I guess, is, what is the human involvement in it, since this is dealing with human behavior. And what questions would I have if I was an administrator, or asking them respectively in regard to safety research or driver behavior research, and even go as far as getting them involved, because we do, as part of my panel, have some of our administrators involved in directing the research and providing input and feedback, and then just really I believe it was Utah a few years back, may have published a paper about the value of research, or one of the state agencies published a paper about the value of research, and it's like a 30-to-1 return. And then even pulling in your strategic highway safety plan emphasis areas, a lot could be done in regard to those areas and the NDS. So really reinforcing plans and actions that are already established is another approach.
Thank you, Dean. It seems Pam is back on. Pam, how do we convince the decision makers to participate in the pool fund study, or even just support research that utilizes the SHARP2 data?
Yeah, so I was just thinking about that. You know, when I worked for the DOT, I was, you know, various times in my career, I was staff and I was also a decision maker. And as a staff member, I, you know, understood and was prepared to address the issues that Tim talked about in terms of competing with all the other safety research funds and needs. So my topic would have to rise to the top in terms of a department need, and I would have to show that it was a very high priority in order to be above the line, if you will, for funding. As a decision maker, I wanted to know how my department would benefit from the contribution that was included, that might be a conclusion of the pool fund study in this case. And I guess I'm going to try to answer a question with a question here, and I'm going to put FHWA on the spot, but that's what, you know, discussions are about. I think it would be helpful for some of the state DOTs to make that case if they had a better handle on what topics might be proposed for research, where they might be able to plug in, how it might address one of their safety concerns, high priority safety concerns in their state. How might that state be able to benefit from that research that's being done as a group? So, I mean, those are the things I'd want to know as a decision maker, and throw that back a little bit at FHWA. Can we identify the safety topics that this pool fund study might be used for? Can we identify a timeline for research? Can we identify a timeline for deployment of potential countermeasures so that the state DOTs do have something that they can go to the decision makers with and say, this is how we could substantially benefit from our contributions?
Right. Okay. So
Charles?
Go ahead.
And
yeah.
Charles, before you answer, I want Brett to bring up the poll that requires some additional information from the participants in terms of their interest level. While he's putting them on, Charles, you want to maybe address Pam's question in terms of, you know, what are the plans? Are the DOTs going to be part and parcel of that pool fund in terms of the research and the topics and the management of it?
Right. So, you know, the general management of it, you know, that's in the paperwork, that's in all those headaches the Federal Highway will take care of. In terms of the research, that's actually to be determined by the people that participate, that technical advisory committee. Having said that, you know, any one of the IEPs or BAAs could be further supported to go to a phase 3. Those would be the lower hanging fruit because those are identified in the majority of the work would have already been done. But the ultimate decision would be up to the technical advisory committee. So this is not, that's why we try to emphasize we're leading it, but we're not going to dominate it. The focus of this is for states. So I think what we're going to try to do is reach out to the current states that have shown interest in the pooled fund but might not have put on an online commitment yet. And that's just a commitment. That's not an obligation. That's kind of an intent. I think it more falls in line of an intent versus obligating funds. So it's a commitment in that sense. But we'll reach out to those. Some of those participate in the BAAs and IAPs. We'll reach out to them as well to maybe get a handle on some of those questions, Pam. In terms of timeline, that's a difficult one, right?
Right.
Having said that, I really think that I know we're potentially trying to encourage some of the BAAs for this too, is again what we're calling low-hanging fruit. You know, developing new countermeasures, that's not that easy of a thing. Improving existing ways that we're doing things through predictive modeling, and the examples that I gave you of the I gave you an example from operations related to models of trying to incorporate driver behavior through work zones, but even on speed management of an improvement of some of the models in the highway safety manual. So maybe what, and I'm now throwing it back to Pam, is maybe we could have potentially an offline conversation to how to maybe do some outreach to focus in on that. Now, we've already begun some work, preliminary work, to address safety, operations, and planning. And so for safety, for those of you not familiar, SHARP 2 began with 500 research questions. That was then honed down to around 250, and then it was categorized into, like, I think 30 or 25 or 30 categories of research questions. We have a project now to evaluate, I think they have a hold of 50 reports related to safety, to look at how well the data are supporting particular types of research questions. This will be presented as a white paper to the Technical Advisory Committee as they are help them develop their research plan. And then for operations and planning, we have to kind of start at scratch by basically coming up with the list of research questions. We already have a lot of that in terms of route choice, destination choice, even trip distribution for electric vehicles. So I don't know if I completely answered your question, Pam, but I hope I answered a part of it.
Yeah, and I think the discussion needs to continue, and I think the more involvement from the state DOTs, the more successful this program is going to be, because ultimately these are the agencies that are going to implement the research results. So when they have more of a stake in it in terms of deciding on the ideas and the research, I think that gives us a better chance to take this into implementation.
Yeah, and I wanted to add, because we have talked to the AASHTO RAC, and we got a kind of a recommendation about outreach where they actually thought it might be more useful to have almost one-on-one calls with the state. So you would have the RAC member bring somebody from their safety office, their operations, and if they have a planning office together, and then Federal Highway can have a conversation with them about the pooled fund and how we see the value and where it would be moving forward. If anybody is willing now, either through the chat pod or sending me an email, if they thought that would be a good idea for their state, we'd be happy to set up those calls. It's potentially a lot of calls, potentially over 50 some odd hours on our part, but I think we're willing to do that.
And people are filling in the polls, and I know it looks like one state has plans to participate, 2 states are interested, and they're going to suggest that their organization participate. So I think we're making progress in terms of making folks aware of it, and again, if you have questions, you can talk to any of us, talk to Charles about the pool fund study, talk to Federal Highway, and let's kind of get this whole thing moving forward. So when it's time to start deciding on those performance measures and targets for safety, we have the tools that allow us to achieve those targets. It is a minute after 2:30 Eastern Standard Time. I'm impressed that we still have a lot of participants on the line. I know there weren't many questions, but we had a really good discussion. I want to thank Charles, Pam, Tim, Mohammed, and Dean for participating. I also like to thank Brett. This is our fourth of a 4 webinar series. Brett has done a fantastic job organizing these and helping us with the technology and the entire process. I want to thank Aladdin and Monique from Federal Highway Turner Fairbank for supporting this and being active participants in the whole process. If there are no more questions or comments, I think, Brett, we will go ahead and end